Okay, thank you. Then I wish it's a pleasure to welcome so much to the public session here at the International Association of Religion Journalists Conference in Warsaw, Poland. Welcome to the Polish journalists, the scholars, and thank you for spending an afternoon in the very warm afternoon in here at the Faculty of Journalism. My name is Astrid Dalehaug Norheim. I'm a journalist and I'm a news editor of the daily Norwegian newspaper Dagen. And I also a member of the IARJ. This session is sponsored by the Association of Religion Data Archives, ARDA. Thank you very much to ARDA for making it possible. And as you see, it will be streamed. It's a pleasure to introduce the scholars to this session, and they are holding a torch on the topic From Solidarność Forward, the tangled web of religion, history, and politics of Eastern Europe. First, Krzysztofer Gaborski, Associate Professor at Maria Curie Sklodowska University in Lublin, and author of the book Religious Life in Poland. Then Ina Medjanova, Senior Researcher at Adjunct Assistant Professor at the Irish School of Ecumenics, Trinity College in Dublin, Ireland, and currently a visiting professor at the Center for Trust, Peace and Social Relation at Coventry University. Ina has done extensively research on religious role at Balkans, written several books, latest books on Muslims on Balkans. And Malgorzata Glowacka-Graper, Assistant Professor of Institute of Sociology here at the University of Warsaw. This year actually issued a book on memory and religion in local communities in Poland. Looking so much forward to listening to you. Each of them will give a presentation, then we have a talk and open to the floor for questions and remarks. So please listen carefully and write down what you'd like to say afterwards. Is the sound good for the streaming and you can easily hear us? Very good, very good. First then, Krzysztofer Gaborski, we would like very much to hear about religious life in Poland, please.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me. My presentation will primarily focus on the social events affecting religion in Poland that are beneath the surface of or overlooked when examining the more institutional aspects and aid in understanding political trends. Since I have to be brief, I'll deal mainly with the dominant Catholic tradition, but I'll initially introduce some pertinent political background. It's virtually a truism that religion was an essential force in augmenting the spirit of resistance to the totalitarian communist regime for Poles, not the least in this solidarity movement of the 1980s. However, it would seem that the eponymous solidarity is largely dissipated. In part, the explanation is fairly straightforward. Once a common foe disappeared, the complexities of life in radically transformed and ever more pluralistic society created tensions that found various political expressions, some fairly pronounced, each side often goading the other to further extremes. Before examining some of the crucial implications for religion, a broader social issue should be looked at, which has its roots in the resistance to the totalitarian state. The virtually iconic solidarity movement has been called a self-limiting revolution. Among other things, John Paul's insistence on the need for nonviolence was crucial. There's a key scene in Andrzej Wajda's Valenza, a man of hope of 2013, that illustrates one of the less noted but crucial elements inspiring this strategy. After the August strike has been renewed, despite the seeming initial success of negotiations, the kid gloves are off. The regime's forces are gathering for what seems to be an inevitable violent confrontation with the workers who occupy the shipyard. Two workers are near the gate and discussing the turn of events. The first worker is young and unmarried. He's ready for a fight because he can no longer tolerate living under the Russian heel. The second, slightly older and married, wishes they had quit while they were ahead. The struggle of both perspectives is personified in the film through Walesa himself, who fights for freedom and dignity, but is always aware of the consequences for his family. Indeed, all his actions are shown to have consequences for his wife and family. Nevertheless, at a certain level, family was a key to successful resistance. It inspired political realism and, not to be too rash, but additional motivation to fight for change. It bears noting that next to religion, the family as an institution was held in quite low esteem by the communists, since it made the individual family members more difficult to manipulate. In Poland, the two were closely interrelated. Cardinal Wyszynski, who led the Polish church from the Stalinist period to Solidarity, had made it a primary concern to strengthen the family. Thus, one of the great services of the church at the time, supporting the family to the extent that the institution remained surprisingly intact. It was this significantly enhanced through religion reservoir of human capital, to use economist Gary Becker's term for the contribution of the family to society, that after 1989, Poles started their struggle to transform their economy from a backward centralized command economy to a market one to become, as one economist put it, Europe's growth champion. However, despite the undoubted success of the transformation at one level, the stress it has induced upon Polish society had enormous consequences at numerous other levels, including the religious one. And this goes beyond the more evident fact that the economic success was unevenly distributed. Among other matters, economic uncertainty and increased mobility within Polish society to its current demographic crisis. This gives a partial answer to the question raised of why a predominantly Catholic society has such a low birth rate. Demographer Mary Eberstadt argues a low birth rate is a key factor in restructuring family in a manner which generates a substantial decline in religious practices. Things have not gone so far in Poland, but a clear distinction exists between the higher level of religious practices of older Poles and the younger ones. Among the mechanisms of this process, many younger Poles from smaller communities settle in larger cities in search of employment, where they may lack the support of extended family, and subsequently, the influence of tradition subsides. As the numerous new housing developments spread to the outskirts of larger municipal centers, construction of new churches is not keeping a pace, which undoubtedly has an impact on religious practice. I'll have to look into the question of the size of tables as well later on, as we learned in the last session. However, if religious practice is decreased among younger Poles under the new circumstance, religion has to a larger extent become a matter of personal choice rather than received tradition. And perhaps unsurprisingly, a deeper religiosity of a significant percentage of these Poles is also evident. Among them is a more liberal trend of young Catholics who are more openly critical of developments within the institutional church, but that hardly means more conservative Catholics from this generation are blind to problems within the church. Religion still seems to be an important factor in shaping national identity for many young Catholics, but this is to a great extent an independently thought out response to a venerable tradition. Real problems within the institutional church. A gravely serious issue is the problem of pedophilia in the church. Surveys show that this seriously damaged the authority of the church, especially after the recent drastic Siekierski Brothers documentary. Political scientist Jaroslav Flis claims the problem is no greater in the church than in society at large, but the institution can lose a great deal of authority within Polish society to deal honestly and effectively with the problem. This problem, as well as other ones, partially explain the renewed appearance of the phenomena of anti-clericalism. However, because of the comparatively strong presence of religion in Poland, an anti-clerical backlash is a natural development and historically has long accompanied religious life in the country. It might reasonably be claimed that it was through the necessity of confronting a common foe under communism that a truce in this phenomena occurred. Nevertheless, just as religious life in the country differs considerably from earlier periods, anti-clericalism also has a modern expression. In his book, The New Anti-Catholicism from 2003, Protestant historian Philip Jenkins has labeled anti-Catholicism in the United States the last acceptable prejudice. Has the prejudice found a new home in Poland? Well, consider this. On the grounds of existing laws in Poland, confirmed by the Court of Justice of the European Union, it is against the law to offend people's religious sensibilities in the country. But instances of offending religious sensibilities have multiplied of late, not to mention a knife attack on a priest just a few days ago. Well, to end this 8 minutes, Norman Davies has called Poland the heart of Europe. Neither Europe nor that heart are in particularly great shape at present. I feel part of what ails both is an inordinate focus on the autonomous self. This rigid axiological model tends to reduce relations between people to questions of power, and thus effectively is detrimental to the spirit of dialogue, despite the lip service the latter is given. It is the voice of religion most powerfully represented by the Catholic Church in Poland that directs many Poles toward a self-transcendent communitarian self, in the sense of Viktor Emil Frankl's definition, that is so vital to the common good in society and so necessary for that heart to continue beating for the country so that the latter can indeed also serve Europe, whether as its heart or not.
Thank you very much. I actually have a question. As a Norwegian, I see a lot of the same trends occurring in the church in Norway as you are talking about here. And we never had communism. We have a very low birth rate, decline in the religious practices, and also a religion as is a matter of personal choice. Is this the same, the development in Poland, is that just mirroring the rest of the Western Europe, or is it any specific for Poland?
Well, I think since there are some of the similar circumstances, like the lowering of the birth rate, and what this includes, mobility and so on. So to the extent that religion is dependent on tradition, which, well, some may criticize, but isn't such a bad thing. Can I digress for a second? Since you're from the Scandinavian countries, one of the films that I enjoyed watching was the Italian for Beginners by this Dogma, and well, there were a group of young people that were trying to do certain things. We're talking here about doing certain things. But what was frightening there was the frightened look of the elderly. And this kind of continuity in Poland between different generations, the elderly, at least it's been noticed by, well, by, let's say, a Swiss friend of mine, seem to be more confident of themselves than in Western countries. So now that continuity, I think, together with, along with religion, well.
Thank you very much. Ina Medjanova, we're moving on to Balkans and your research. Looking forward to hearing you.
Thanks to the organizer for having me here at this very interesting and exciting events. I think it's also very useful and it needs to start a tradition for East European journalists. My sphere of research is a part of Eastern Europe known as the Balkans or Southeast Europe. This is a place where four religious traditions, Eastern and Western Christianity, Judaism and Islam, have coexisted and interacted for centuries. I am, in my research, particularly interested in how religious identities have been involved in national identities in this part of the world, but also what has been the place of religion in both conflict and peace building, given that the breakup of the Soviet regimes or pro-Soviet regimes in this part of the world didn't go peacefully as it happened elsewhere. How religious pluralism has been managed and controlled under the Ottoman Empire, due to which Islam expanded in this part of the world, had important implications for the way in which religion was further implicated and involved in the building of national identities and in the national liberation struggles. Basically, the system of social organization under the Ottomans was based on religion as a boundary of communal identity rather than any other factors like territory or race or ethnicity or language for that matter. So basically with the appearance of nationalist ideologies among the different populations in the Balkans, religion became heavily involved in the construction of national identity and one of the banners for the liberation struggles. After the establishment of the modern nation states, this privileging of one religion as core identity of the nation brought many difficulties with the plural societies in the Balkans, because being Serbian understood as being Orthodox, or being Bulgarian or Romanian understood as being Orthodox, in the same way as being Catholic, being equalized with being Croat, ask the question, what about Jews, Muslims, Protestants? Are they part of the national body, or are they part of some foreign nations? For this matter, religion became very politicized, and this had very important consequences also in the way religion reappeared in the post-communist society. So under communism, we all know religion was marginalized to a great extent, in some places like Albania, completely erased from the public sphere. Yet with the reappearance of religious liberty in the public sphere, religion also became very visible. So it was implicated in complex sociological processes. Religion was important as an individual faith, but also it was very important at social level as a communal bonding force, and also at political level, because religion became also an instrument of ideologizing and also building of boundaries between the different communities, something which was very evident during especially the war in Bosnia, a multinational state. Because religion was so visible during the wars in ex-Yugoslavia, and visible meaning religious clergy was following armies and blessing armies in battle, or religious sites were targeted everywhere where warfare happened. Religion was perceived as a very important means of peace building as well by many international organizations that arrived during and after the war in Bosnia and later in Kosovo to promote peaceful and reconciled societies. So again, these were not religious wars, these were wars for nationalist redistribution of territory and economic resources, but this visibility of religion made religion a very important source of enticing hostility and also deepening boundaries between different communities. So interreligious dialogue consequently became a key tool in promoting peaceful and reconciled society after the end of the wars. However, in the research I have done, I have tried to see which practices and policies of interreligious dialogue have worked and which have failed to produce sustainable results for various reasons. So we also, I think we need to address also the weakness of this use or instrumentalization of interreligious dialogue in post-conflict societies. And among my major suggestions for expanding and somehow addressing this instrumentalization of interreligious dialogue in a positive way that makes it not only a means of governmentality in the neoliberal democratization that arrived in the Balkans after the fall of communism, but also in a way that really promotes understanding and reconciliation. It needs to create inclusive spaces in which different religious traditions not only speak of their similarities and differences in terms of theological understandings and ideologies, but also address their economic, social, and political concerns first. Second, it needs to be expanded into a sort of inter-worldview dialogue because in the post-communist societies in the Balkans, we can say that secularists or people who are agnostics do not present an important share of society, so they need to be involved in issues of social concern. Another weakness of dialogue so far has been the lack of addressing gender imbalances. As we speak of interreligious dialogue, we often think of high-level hierarchs talking politely to each other on important theological issues, but not including grassroots level lay people and particularly women. So these gender imbalances are important because they also speak of different access to dialogue and structure different outcomes of this dialogue. And last but not least, interreligious dialogue needs to be democratized. It needs to be make a really inclusive event process rather than being restricted to theological discussions or to religious related activities. It needs to address, again, important economic grievances, majority minorities imbalances, and also to promoting social engagement rather than keep itself within the religious spheres alone. Okay, do I have more time? Or?
You can have a couple of minutes more.
Okay. There were some questions today in the previous discussions about majority churches or majority religious communities having difficulties addressing problems within their own constituencies. And I think this could also be an important aspect of interreligious dialogue, so creating spaces where religious functionaries not only speak of issues of common concern, but also address their own mistakes and their own weaknesses. In the Balkans, for example, after the wars, when religious hierarchy was asked to sit together and discuss issues of reconciliation, all of the majority communities' leadership spoke about the faults of the others and the negative roles of the others in the war, but nobody addressed the concerns and the participation in these atrocities of their own communities. So creating these safe spaces, dialogic spaces where communities could freely speak about difficult issues, reflecting on their own internal instabilities and their own participation in events which somehow distance themselves from the message, from the universalistic message they want to bring to the world, would be a very good aspect of interreligious dialogue as well.
Hello. Yeah, thank you very much. So interesting listening to you. I have a lot of questions. I will ask only one by now. To what extent did the religious peace talks be for more than just the religious leaders? Did it reach out to ordinary people? Or was it just religious leaders meeting behind a closed door, talking to each other?
Yes, so interreligious dialogue has been promoted under different forms and at different levels. So basically, the most promoted form was the meeting between the religious leadership and either behind the closed doors or openly when the situation gets politically more relaxed. But I would argue that the most successful forms of interreligious dialogue have been when this top-down dialogue that was actually prioritized by international community was somehow combined with grassroots level and mid-level clergy and layperson participation, which would enrich and encompass the situation, because the situation is very complex in the Balkans. Also, interreligious dialogue has been promoted, and this is very important to say, given that we're an international audience here, especially by Western agencies and governmental and non-governmental organizations, in a way that has been insensitive and sometimes ignorant about the local context, which has sometimes produced the negative results which have led to perceptions of interreligious dialogue as a politically driven activity rather than a real sincere search for reconciliation and building of peaceful societies. And this needs to be said and needs to be addressed by international actors. One more thing I want to add. In a book which I researched and published, wrote and published together with Professor Patrice Brodeur from the University of Montreal, we provide a chapter with policy recommendations which are addressed both to international and local actors, how to do interreligious dialogue in a way, how to turn interreligious dialogue into a more efficient activity. And there is a special recommendation related to journalism, and we recommended that actually journalists who were reporting on, or who are reporting on religious-related events and processes need to take some training into religious issues, but also clergy and priests who are supposed to somehow translate their theological messages into relevant messages to the audiences need to take some trainings into journalism or at least in public relations skills so that they can really express their concerns and address issues related to their presence in society. Thank you.
Oh, thank you very much. Then we're heading back to Poland, and Małgorzata have done extensive research on the local communities. Please, looking forward to hearing you.
Yeah, thank you very much for an invitation for this a very new initiative for me, because I'm mainly a memory scholar. But I want to present you a research project of mine and Zuzanna Bogumił on the close relations between religion and memory in local communities in Poland. Because when you when you investigate a cultural landscape in Poland, you can easily find that religious language maintains a continuous hold over both local and state national history remembrance practices. And during communist times, communist authorities attempted to create a secular and non-religious language of commemorating especially the Second World War as the most important event of 20th century. But even in that time, we had this religious language in the commemoration practices. Church was always a very important memory actor. And in local communities, churches, chapels, and first of all, cemeteries were the main places where commemorative practices were held. But even in these official commemorations, sometimes the religious symbols, such as cross, first of all, also were present, as, for example, in Gdańsk, in the Solidarity movement was born, this monument with 3 crosses commemorating the fallen shipyard workers were built during communist times. And everywhere a Maltian cross commemorating the Warsaw citizens killed during the war, and they were established during 50s in communist time. But we were interested in the question how local community embedded in these religious symbols and with its parish culture, first of all, react to the new initiatives of Polish states, which are also religious ones. So we have these 2 kinds of religious language. National one, when the Polish state uses a religious symbol to promote the narration of Polish national martyrology, and the local one. And this local one is mainly concentrated on the dead people from the families, from the neighborhood, but not in this framework of martyrology, and for sure not national martyrology. We investigated mainly the projects, the memory projects connected with villages. So the Mausoleum of Martyrdom of Polish villages, also the biggest Mausoleum of Martyrology of Polish nation in Poland, which is in fact a church institution. But it is combined, what is important, with only one pantheon of Polish peasants in Poland. Also the commemorations of Ulma family in Markowa, when this family killed because they were hiding Jews, they were commemorating by building a museum which uses religious language, but which in fact was opposed by local people, not because they didn't want to commemorate this family, but because they didn't want the modern religious language. They wanted to stay with their own ways of using it. We investigated also the very dramatic case of Jedwabne, when in fact this national commemoration is religious one, but in the Jewish religion, not in the Roman Catholic. But the local community established religious Catholic ways of coping with that trauma and with the image of divine punishment that was imposed on them because of what they did. And these local communities possess their own vernacular mode of remembering and commemorating the past. And using this typology of Ji-Hyun Lim, of different kinds of victims, we may say that they are concentrated on victims as ordinary people, innocent and killed with any reason. Another kind of victims is called by Lim sacrificed. That's victims that are conscious victims, that give their lives to save family, friends, or a nation even, as a group of people. And this commemoration of Polish state is concentrated on this second type of victims, but on the local level, it is mainly seen as a mass of people who were part of families of people living today. And it is rather not a commemoration commemoration of a national character, but a religious obligation to remember the dead one. And in these different local communities, Polish state built big museums or memory sites, and in every of which community there were conflict over it. And this conflict was almost exclusively on the way of using religious symbols, such as cross, such as statue of Virgin Mary, and so on. Because what they were afraid of is to, rather taking away from them their way of thinking about religious obligation. They were even afraid that using these religious symbols, religious language, will be against religion, in fact, because it is on such abstract level, but it is not connected with their everyday experience. of religion practices. And of course, all these communities on Polish villages don't live only in this Paris culture. They know what is going on in the world. They have access to internet, to mass media, and so on. And they can see also the ways of commemoration that are, let's say, popular in the world. And what was the most important for us was this movement for the canonization of martyrs of the Second World War. Because we had a mass canonization in the Roman Catholic Church, but also in the Russian Orthodox Church, in the Belarusian, also what is important in the Polish case, because new martyrs of Orthodox Church are now commemorating in the eastern parts of Poland. Also Armenian Church canonized, did this mass canonization 3 years ago. And now we find this new fascinating process of using this pattern, these narratives on new martyrs in Polish society. From the one hand, it's an initiative of Polish state. For example, commemorating or canonization the Ulma families. But on the other side, using it by some parts of Roman Catholic Church in Poland, because the biggest sanctuary and the biggest museum in Poland devoted to these new martyrs of Second World War was built in Toruń by Radio Maria and Father Rydzyk, and it is the main place where people from different parts of Poland, from local communities, can go and pray in the chapel devoted to these new martyrs, and we think it's a new phenomenon for further investigation, of course. And what is very important here, I think, is to see these religious commemorations not as an effect of influence of narrative of Polish national martyrology, but it is rather choosing this cross, this religious symbol, because it is thought as a natural ways of thinking about commemorating the dead people from their own families. And it is not connected with martyrology, but rather with this environment of memory or milieu de mémoire, as Pierre Nora named it. So thinking about the past in the religious way, and thinking that religious way are the only proper ones to commemorate the past.
Thank you very much. So interesting listening to you all the way up to today, how it works, and it's still continuing. We are having 35 minutes, and I will now open to the floor for questions and remarks. And please introduce yourself and where you're from when asking questions for the stream. Do you take the microphone, please? Anyone? Doug, please.
Douglas Todd from Vancouver, Canada. I guess a question for Christopher. You spoke about the rise of anti-Catholicism, but most of today people have been talking about Islamophobia or anti-Semitism. What can you say about those three things and how they fit together or don't fit together or that sort of thing?
Well, how do the three fit together? That's a very good question, because they are rather separate. I think part of this anti-Catholicism is, well, deeper than an anti-clericalism. It is a kind of a trend of a feeling that religion sort of holds people back, and well, so the largest religion is the easiest target. Like, for instance, one of the parties wanted to remove religious education from Polish schools. Well, that would affect not only the Catholic Church, but that would affect the Orthodox Church, because the Orthodox teach religion in the Eastern Poland, and the Lutherans, if any other, in southwestern Poland. So, but the aim is to get well, the strongest religious group, and that's well, like we pointed out here, that's something that's in the United States. It's in different countries. I don't know how. I know the literature in the United States, and I've been observing a bit lately in Poland, but so it's hard to say how it's like in the rest of of Europe. I'm not, so that is something a little different. So anti-Semitism, on the other hand, well, it's here you have the problem of whether you're talking about right-wing anti-Semitism or left-wing anti-Semitism, because both are present in Europe now, and the serpent has bitten the tail in Poland as well. So, and that there's a book by a Polish sociologist, Alexander Herz, who wrote about anti-Semitism in Poland in the past from a slightly different perspective. He pointed out that it did have something to do with, well, Jews as intermediators, rather, and having a certain edge above, the lower classes, and he compared it to attitudes towards the Chinese diaspora in Asia, right? So there is that aspect, and since what seems to be the case here, like when you have reparations and things like that, where it flares up, so property is connected in some ways, for better or worse. So it has, and not to mention that it is affecting people who are not religious. In other words, young conservatives, young right-wing people who are the least religious part of the population. So, and well, Islam, I guess that's here. Well, that's a complicated issue in Poland. Like we said, that there is a Muslim community. So, not to repeat some of the things that were said in earlier sessions, there's the Tatar community, and so, for instance, one of the Tatars is a former imam of Gdańsk. He's a supporter of the Law and Justice Party, right? Because he feels that it has the same value system as Islam as he understands it, right? So that's, I always get his name wrong. Yes.
Thank you. You can pass the microphone backwards for the next question, please.
This is Maria Paz Lopez, IARJ board director and Spanish journalist. I wanted to put a question to Professor Grachpe on what you explained about canonization of martyrs. Because in Spain we had this issue with beatification of martyrs from the civil war, because they suffered religious persecution, and the main point was to find out if they were killed for what the Catholic Church says in odium fidei, because of hate for faith, or for political reasons. And this provoked a heated debate in the politics in Spain, because what is the Catholic Church reviving this episode and saying it's religious when it is politics. So I wanted to hear more about this issue in the Polish case, if you could elaborate more. Thank you.
In Polish case, it is rather a religious question, which is sometimes used for political reason, because in all cases we have all these processes, from beatification and to canonization process, and even such a case as Ulma family. The beatification process was started in 2003, and it is not completed until today. So it is not a mass canonization as in other cases. It is rather canonization or beatification with all procedures that should be done, but the examples are used in the memory project and in the sometimes for the political reason, which is very visible, especially as you asked, in the Polish-Jewish relations. Because there were process of beatification of more than 100 martyrs of Second World War, and the Ulma family were excluded from this process to the separate one because of what they did, because they had a Jewish family. So it is a very good example for Polish states in all this discussion on the Polish-Jewish relations during World War II. Is really a hard question and hard issue, because it is an example that you can show to the world. And for example, when the Museum of Ulmas was built, it was just after the opening, it was a place for meeting the Visegrad group, for meeting of international meeting of leaders of countries from Central Europe, to show that this place is very important and to promote this history of Ulma family. But of course, in other countries, it is something different. In Russia, it was in fact mass canonization of first of priests killed during Bolshevik Revolution, and in Armenian, it was the canonization of all killed during Armenian genocide. It was in fact some people in Armenia, especially from the academy, were really astonished or even anger on this, because it is not something that, in their opinion, should be done in such a place.
Thank you. Anyone else? Yes, please. Can you pass over the microphone?
Thank you. My name is Anna Wilczyńska. I'm from Krakow, Poland. So I have a question for Ina. You mentioned that women are underrepresented in the bodies that are conducting religious dialogue. Why would they be important to be included in those groups, and what can be done to include them in those mechanisms and in those groups that take care of religious dialogue?
Thanks for this question. Actually, in grassroots level, women are not underrepresented in such interreligious meetings. Even we can speak of a specific form of interreligious dialogue called women's dialogue, and women were in the forefronts in many places, post-conflict places in the Balkans, where different communities would not speak to each other, would not cross communal boundaries at all, but women were those who first went to their neighbors and somehow started the dialogue. So if they are underrepresented, they're underrepresented in the middle level and high level dialogue, where they are not the majority constituencies, neither among the hierarchs where they are not present at all, or at the middle level where they are represented in very few numbers. As for why they need to be represented, of course, because this is an important part of reconciliation and dialogue in society. Everybody needs to be represented, not just women. So let me just point to different levels of dialogue. So you can have, as I said, this high level, mid-level, and grassroots level dialogue, but you can also have dialogue which is defined according to the constituency of those doing dialogue. So youth dialogue, for example, or women's dialogue, or according to their profession, like theological dialogue, monastic dialogue, or lay people dialogue. So the important thing about indigenous dialogue is not to just limit itself into one level, or in one area, but to become a really inclusive place for exchange and expression of grievances, hopes, and struggles for a better world. That should be the mission of dialogue.
So, thank you. And just to follow up, since women are so successful in reconciliation on the grassroots level, what can be done to bring more of them to the higher levels of this dialogue?
Sometimes this happens from itself. For example, in Kosovo, we encountered a very interesting initiative which was sponsored by a Protestant organization to bring people from the Serbian and from the Albanian community together to some dialogue events. And then they, because this was a long-term project, step by step, men started joining their women to these places of dialogue. So there are different ways in which dialogue can be expanded. Sometimes it happens intentionally. Of course, you can work consciously to really include more people beyond just this gender division. But also sometimes it happens from itself, because good examples are important, as are the bad examples, unfortunately.
Thank you. Any other questions? Then I'll ask. Oh, I'm sorry.
I have a question. I have a question to Professor Glowacka-Grajper about, you know, this kind of the different levels of memory. Because an instance from, not from a small community, but a fairly large local community, Lublin, well, on the one hand, you had the monument, well, the statue of the Red Army soldier liberating the city, or liberating the country. And of course, after 1989, after a short while, that was taken down. But in the cemeteries, you talk about cemeteries, there's a cemetery for a section for the Red Army soldiers, and to this very day, candles are lit there during this All Souls, All Saints Day holiday. So what do you think of that type of division of memory here?
Exactly, we can have exactly the same example in Warsaw, because all monuments were devastated, in fact. The last one in October, last year, the last one in Warsaw, but we have a huge cemetery for more than 20,000 soldiers. Red Army soldiers in Warsaw. And it is a very interesting place because it is a place completely abandoned, symbolically abandoned and excluded from the landscape. It is not devastated, nothing is in fact there. And one argument is because it is a cemetery, because the real bodies are there in the soil. So you can't do this. It's a barbarian thing to move dead bodies. But there is also another interpretation, more political one. So if we do anything to the cemeteries of Soviet soldiers, probably Polish cemeteries in Russia will be endangered.
I ask a question first and afterwards you will have, Ina, when listening to you about the experiences from the peace talks at Balkans, now today we have been talking about a very highly polarized society of different countries. Is there anything we can learn from the peace talks among religions in Balkans, how to solve the current situation in European countries?
Thanks. This is a very difficult question. Of course, there are findings in our research that can be applied beyond the boundaries of the Balkans, and I think the messages are this focus on inclusivity, focus on more women involved in dialogue, focus on issues and concerns beyond purely theological issues like economic inequalities and other grievances, cultural racism, as in the case of Islamophobia or in the case of anti-Semitism. So interreligious dialogue needs to be reformulated in a more inclusive way, and that's probably the major message for other places which try to build reconciliation on the through interreligious encounter. Yeah, that's my message.
Thank you. Could you pass the microphone to the first? Oh, yeah, okay. Yelena afterwards, please.
Just one short observation. As I told you, I am the practical man, so nothing above ground. Frombork, there is a city in north part of Poland, the one of this part which was taken from Germany, given to Poland. I was the mid-90s and I went to cemetery, which, as you know, always it's worth to go to. And the cemetery was on a hill. So when I was going up the hill, there were Polish graves with Polish names. But then I turned back and I noticed that on the other side of these graves are German names. What was going on after the war? They just switched it. And they were, you know, on the old cemetery, they were putting Polish people, but there were graves of German people there, because Frombork then was, for 100 years, was German. So for me, it's a symbolic way of introducing to complicated history.
Okay, thank you. Next question or remark, please.
It's question. Thank you, all of you. And as I'm from Serbia, Jelena, and as someone who lives in the region, I cannot agree more with that what Ina Merjanova talked about, really. What I wanted to ask in this this dialogue between nations, we have one phenomenon very present, and this is the phenomenon of competitive victimhood. So it's always the competition whose victims, about numbers of victims and who suffered more and who had war destiny comparing to others, of course. So what do you think, what's the role of the churches and the religious communities in that? And what could they do in order to, how to say, to overcome from those narratives and those discourses, which I found quite dangerous. Thank you.
Yes, this is a very important issue. I said a few words, but let me expand on this. I would say that interreligious dialogue should be practiced as a safe space or safe spaces where churches and religious representatives could open. So first we need to create those safe spaces so that religious communities feel safe to open to the others and to speak not only critically of the mistakes and misdeeds of the other religious groups, but also address their own mistakes and their own weaknesses. This would definitely allow for and bring in more credibility for these groups in the eyes of larger communities, because all of the religions were implicated in one way or another in enticing hostility during the war. Even when they did not necessarily send hostile messages, with the enormous symbolic power they command among the population, they were implicated in deepening differences and focusing on boundaries. So addressing this negative role and not just the positive pastoral role would be a creative and an important first positive step for those communities to do more memory work, because this is something which all of the communities in the Balkans need to do after, especially after the conflicts in the 1990s. And also we can expand a bit this idea of memory work and speak of dialogical memories, that is, memories that speak to each other in a free manner. It is the aim of such type of dialogue is not necessarily to for everybody to agree on the issues that are discussed and that are being said and that have been grievances for the community, but for those community to feel safe, to speak, to open up, and to somehow search for a better understanding. That's, reconciliation is not an easy process, and most of international activists who were involved in interreligious dialogue after the conflicts in the Balkans had this false expectations that we will do several interreligious dialogue projects and reconciliation will follow up. No, peace building and reconciliation is a long-term, incremental, step-by-step process, and it is a pity that international community also assumed that because there is no more violent conflict in the Balkans, they could now move on to other places like Syria, Africa. Of course, those places are more obviously in need of dialogue, but this does not mean that all regions where conflict has been recent need to be abandoned. Dialogue and efforts need to continue probably 1-2 generations in order for reconciliation to be achieved.
Thank you. I have also another question for you. During the religious dialogue, which role did media play? Did we journalists play any role at all? We normally say that the traditional way we are looking about for the problems, critical things happening, but now we also have more of a new adapted way, constructive journalism. We're looking for solutions. We're looking for someone who has found a solution to write and report about them. So what did you see? Did media play any role in the peace talks?
Of course, journalists were very essential to spreading out the messages of those peaceful efforts and dialogue, even though journalists as a rule remain more focused on conflict and violence. I think that maybe because of this lack of sensitivities towards religion, due to atheist past, when of course religion were not a subject of study, or let's say it even this way, religious ignorance, sometimes the way these meetings have been reported maybe has not been completely adequate. That's why education, I think, again, would repeat, would be a key, and promotion of peace journalism, these new trends in the peace studies, would be a key to better understand and spread the message of reconciliation and peace building.
Can you give any example of what happened when you say the journalists don't have enough knowledge on how to report on religion?
Bad things could happen. For example, misunderstanding and differences can be deepened because of misreported words or misreported statement by certain religious activists, or the way a certain event has been addressed can also add additional tension rather than help reconciliation and promotion. And also, yeah, you have different types of journalism. You can have also a very high standard journalism reporting, which somehow addresses or seeks to be more encompassing in showing the whole picture. And you have also bias and one-sided reporting for various reasons. It's not only ignorance, it could be also politically instigated type of journalism, which we have everywhere in the Balkans right now. So the motives behind could be different, but the result could be no less detrimental to peaceful.
I also have a question too. So you're not going to get any rest here. But it's just a little bit to the side of your specialized area, but you did mention Albania, and you mentioned how it was a completely atheist state, but the last information I came across was that from a Pew survey, that for 50% of Albanians, religion is important, and that's among the very highest in Europe. It's higher than in Poland. I don't know if that's accurate or not, but well, Pew is a respected survey company. And as is fairly common knowledge, there are Catholics, Orthodox, and probably the largest community of Muslims. And yet not so long ago, I think they chose Mother Teresa as kind of a holiday. Was there much argument about that, or was there a consensus, or?
Oh, this is a huge question, and it requires at least 2 hours, but let me be very, very brief. So the Albanian case is a case apart, because nationalist ideology and identity was not built around a religious identity, as in other places in the Balkans. As you said, there are 3 different religions, and even 4, because Bektashism is regarded and think of itself as a separate from the majority Sunni Muslim community. So you have 4 different religious communities. However, this national identity is like a sacred canopy covering and including these different religions in a way, as a famous ideologue of 19th century nationalism in Albania put it the religion of Albanians is Albanianism. So national identity is above all. However, those different religious communities have had different important developments after the fall of communism, and there has been a lot of international focus and help to those communities to reconstitute their institutional and spiritual life, because, as I said, religion was completely wiped out of the public sphere. So when religious freedom was reinstituted, those different communities did not have material resources, did not have the personnel or theological resources to somehow rebuild their lives. So Catholic community was helped by the Vatican, who sent priests and clergy. Orthodox community was held mainly by Greek sent priests, and also the Muslim communities were held by various factors and NGOs in the Middle East and more recently in Turkey. So this created, of course, fragmentation and some tensions between communities, and religion, even though not necessarily practiced, is an important communal identity for Albanians too. And the question about Mother Teresa is very complicated. I can talk about it over coffee.
Okay, thank you very much. And then it's time to wrap up. Thank you very much to all of you. So interesting listening to you. We should drink more coffee, keep on the dialogue. Thank you to all the participants for asking questions and contributing. Thank you to ARDA for making it possible, and thank you to the University of Warsaw for hosting us. Thank you very much.